Welcome back to Legends May Live, where we explore the strange, the mysterious, and the eerie. I'm Drew, and today's story is about two men who started out on what should have been a fun road trip, but ended up finding a lifetime of questions and haunting memories. But before we jump in, you should know that while the stories we explore are, to the best of our knowledge, true, we may not get every detail right, so just take it as entertainment. In the early 1970s, when two men who we'll call Lonnie and Sam set out from southern Utah for a casual road trip into Arizona, it was just going to be a couple of guys in a beat-up Chevy Nova riding the empty back roads that stretched between dust, rock, and just miles of nothing. There was really no planned-out timeline, just this easygoing trip and a map with a few red marks on it and a cooler of warm beer rattling in the back seat. And they'd driven for hours, just talking about life, enjoying the sights, and making jokes. The sun was starting to get low when they hit the last major turnoff, and as they turned, the highway sort of dipped toward a canyon, and just long shadows stretched over jagged rock and brush. It was just this really remote-feeling place that sort of seemed like it's been untouched by man, like this pocket away from civilization. And as they make their way through here, Lonnie turned to Sam, and he's like, "Are you sure this is the right way?" To which Sam responded, "Does it matter? Just as long as it goes somewhere." They didn't know it yet, but they had just left the road they knew and entered one that they weren't meant to find. They drive for about another 10 or 20 minutes, and at this point they're thinking that they should have hit a crossroads by now, or at least a ranch gate or fencing, but the unmarked road just kept going. It was just them, the car, and the road with two slightly narrowing lanes. No road signs, no other traffic, or even tire marks from earlier vehicles. Sam sat with a sort of confused look on his face as he seemed like he was trying to work something out. And then after a few seconds, he just kind of squinted through the windshield and asked, "Wasn't this part supposed to veer east?" And Lonnie pulled out the folded map from the dash. He flattened it over his lap and looked it over carefully before telling Sam, "There's nothing here." Like literally, just blank space between state lines. He glanced at the dashboard clock, which said 6:11 p.m., and looked back down. But when it hit him what time it was, he had to do this double take because that couldn't be right. It had to be at least 7, 8 o'clock. But when he looked again, sure enough, it said 6:11 p.m. And Sam then checked his own watch, but it had stopped. The second hand had frozen in place like it was just ticking against something it couldn't pass. But that's when the radio let out this weird sound. It was this sharp crack of static and then a low voice. It wasn't English and maybe not even human language at all, but the syllables were soft and fluid, but still just off and just kind of wrong. And Lonnie shut it off instinctively, but as he thought about it, it dawned on him that they hadn't passed a radio tower in miles. But before he could come to any conclusions, outside, the color of the dirt began to change. The warm red sand of southern Utah had turned pale. It was almost white and chalky, and the brush lining the roadside was thinner and shriveled like it hadn't seen rain in years. The pavement dipped, it cracked and became uneven, and then they came over the rise. The road dropped off into a shallow canyon bordered by low, cracked ridgelines on either side, and the light there just changed. The sky was still clear, but it felt dimmer somehow, kind of muted, like a film had been put over the sky. And then they saw it. Tucked against the base of the cliffs were structures, maybe 8, possibly 10. They were low to the ground and built from what looked like mud brick or sun-bleached stone. They didn't have doors or visible windows, though. They were just solid, weathered shells of dwellings that had no business still standing. At first, Sam and Lonnie just thought that they were ruins, but then they saw movement. Figures, just slender humanoids standing in the narrow spaces between the buildings. They couldn't make out faces, just these vague outlines, but they could tell that the people's faces were turned toward the road, like these people were looking at them. And Sam slowed down, partly from curiosity, but mostly out of cautious instinct. He and Lonnie both had this eerie feeling as Sam gripped the steering wheel tightly in his hands. He whispered, "What is this place?" And to that, Lonnie responded, "Maybe a reservation?" But deep down, they both knew that that really wasn't the case. Then, all of a sudden, one of the figures stepped forward. It was moving slow and deliberate, and then it raised its hand about halfway, like it was starting to wave, but then it just stopped and dropped its arm like it forgot what it was doing almost. It was kind of like it didn't know how to react to Sam and Lonnie being there any more than the men knew how to react to them. And then suddenly, another figure bolted, just vanishing behind another structure with this unnatural speed. Then the others quickly followed, but they didn't run like normal people. Like they didn't run with their arms pumping and their head jolted forward. Instead, they moved kind of more like Muppets or puppets, just jerking, weightless, kind of this odd bounce, but with astonishing speed. And to that, Sam said, "We're leaving." And without waiting for Lonnie to respond, he threw the car into reverse, spun the wheel around, and dust rose behind them in a blinding arc for just a few seconds before the engine sputtered. The dashboard lights flickered and the car stalled for like half a second. And in that moment, the air itself seemed to vibrate. And the guys felt this pressure just pushing against their skulls. And it was something like altitude sickness that they were experiencing. And Lonnie swore he heard something whispering, and not from the village, but like inside the car. And then the engine caught, and all at once they were on the move again. And they went much faster than they should have on that kind of road. The canyon was just a blur behind them, but the figures, some of them had stepped out onto the road watching them leave. Sam and Lonnie just rode in silence for several minutes, trying to make sense of what they just experienced. The car rumbled over uneven ground, bounced on potholes as they were going breakneck speed, but neither man said a word until the canyon walls started to flatten behind them and that strange village was just so far in the rearview, it just felt like a bad dream at this point. And that's when Lonnie noticed something weird. He pointed out the windshield and said, "Where's the fork?" There should have been a junction, a paved split from earlier, but now there was nothing. Just a single dirt road winding forward through the unfamiliar terrain. And Sam didn't answer. His eyes were locked ahead. The ground had changed again, though. The soil was darker now, less like desert sand and more like volcanic ash. The brush had vanished entirely. Even the horizon looked wrong, like it was warped, like distant hills were kind of bending upward slightly, just enough to unsettle the brain. And so they stopped the car for a moment just to refocus and try to get settled. And Lonnie stepped out. The wind was hot but silent. There was no rustle, no chirping insects, not a single sound of life. And when he looked down at the car's wheels, he froze. Dust that clung to the tires wasn't red like it had been before. It was white, powder black, fine chalk. And he ran his hand across the hood, and it left a long streak behind. But it was like really soft and way too cold. So back inside, Sam stared at the glove box, and he goes, "Didn't we mark this road on the map?" And he opened the box, pulled out the folded highway guide, and they'd circled a few spots earlier that day, and they had drawn red pen along their route. But the road that they had taken was just gone. No marking, no connection. And he blinked a few times as if to kind of refocus his eyes, like maybe he wasn't seeing this right. But that was more of a reflex than anything because he was seeing it perfectly fine. And then just reaching for any kind of resolution, he turned it over to look at the other side, but nothing. And he tells Lonnie, who then comes back over to check it out. And Lonnie's just as confused as he is. And Lonnie goes, "This doesn't make sense. It's not possible. We drew that just this morning." And after a few seconds of looking at the map together, they both just looked back up at the road, and it had changed again. Now it was lined with a rusty, sagging, barbed wire fence. And it wasn't there just a few moments ago, but even if it had been there, it still didn't make sense because they hadn't passed any fencing on the way in. But what was really unnerving was what was beyond it, just beyond the rusty fence. They could see dark shapes in the dust that seemed to be just standing and watching them. And to this, Lonnie quickly got back in the car, and Sam slammed it into gear and again just drove as fast as he could. Way faster than they should have. And not because they thought it would help, but because they felt like something behind them had just decided that they didn't belong. It took nearly 20 minutes of driving, though it felt like hours, before they saw pavement again. And when they got to it, it wasn't a road that they recognized. And again, there were no signs or mile markers, just 2 lanes of stretched out, cracked asphalt that ran along the edge of a dry ravine framed by twisted fence posts and brittle sagebush. And Sam slowed the car, and Lonnie leaned out the window, just scanning the terrain, just trying to figure out where they are, looking for any kind of landmarks. But there were none. No farms, no houses, not even power lines. Until finally something caught their eyes. And it was this small green highway sign. It was almost hidden by overgrowth. And it read, "Welcome to Colorado City." And when they saw that, they just stared, totally dumbfounded, because Colorado City was nearly 50 miles east of where they had entered the canyon, and they hadn't taken a single turn in that direction. They just went in one road and somehow out an entirely different road. So they pulled over and both men checked their watches again, and they're still frozen at 6:11. Same for the car clock. And they still don't know what to make of it all, but for now they just want to get back on track. So Lonnie flipped open the glove box, pulled out the folded paper again to plan where to go from here. But when they looked at the map, he just let out a huge sigh that turned into almost a laugh. He couldn't believe it, but things were still getting stranger. The map itself hadn't changed, but the red pin marks that they had made earlier were completely gone. And at this, Sam opened the door and stumbled out of the car. He dropped to his knees in the dirt and vomited. When Lonnie asked if he was all right, Sam said it felt like something was still inside his head, like a pressure and a ringing, and something just he couldn't shake. But after finally composing himself, getting back in the car, they took off again, and they finally made it back home. But Sam had sleep problems for days. He would wake up in a panic. He had trouble falling asleep. He had nightmares and just restlessness. They tried to talk about it. Lonnie told a coworker, and Sam mentioned it to his brother-in-law, who used to work in land management. But the reactions were always the same. Blank stares, chuckles, and raised eyebrows. No one really believed them. No one took it seriously. And so they decided to go back and investigate with a clear head a week later, but as they tried to retrace the drive, they found nothing. The fork that they had taken was gone. The canyon didn't look the same, and the terrain beyond it was fenced off and had no trespassing signs. They drove the area a dozen times in the years that followed and never found the village, the pale dust, or the road ever again. But then, years later, a connection surfaced. A friend of Sam's who had moved into an academic research position contacted them with something strange. A scanned page from a journal dated 1922. It was written by a land surveyor charting parts of the Utah-Arizona border, and he described coming across a narrow canyon not listed on any federal map, and inside it were windowless, empty stone structures. And just as he turned to leave, he saw figures made of shadow and cloth, moving with a kind of grace that he didn't understand. He ran and was never able to find the place again, and the canyon's name, scratched faintly into the margins of the final page, was Gadianton. Now, in the Book of Mormon, the Gadianton robbers were a secretive group, assassins and conspirators who disappeared into the mountains and were said to have built entire cities hidden from the world. Some say that they were wiped out, others believe they simply moved underground. Regardless if those are connected, desert locals tell stories, quiet ones, about cursed places, thin places where you can step through the veil of time without meaning to, and where the rules of the world seem to blur. Years passed, and Lonnie moved twice, got married, and had kids. He didn't talk about the canyon much anymore. Not because he didn't remember, but because he couldn't explain it, not even to himself. But one fall afternoon, he was digging through an old moving box in his garage when he found that old map. It was soft, sun-faded, and a little brittle at the edges now, but he unfolded it, and the pen marks were still missing. The route that they had drawn was still gone. There was no sign of the red ink, no imprint where the pen had passed. But the paper had a new crease. It was a long diagonal fold across the top corner, one that they didn't recall making, and tucked faintly into the margin in handwriting that neither man recognized were 3 words: "You were seen." And at that, Lonnie shuddered, and he quickly grabbed a box of matches, went outside, and burned the paper. That's it for today's episode of Legends May Live. What would you do if the world around you changed and no one believed you? If you enjoyed today's story, please drop a like, follow, and share it with a friend. Also, check out our website, legendsmaylive.com. And until next time, keep a lookout and stay away from strange roads, because you never know who may be watching.